What is up guys, Photo Fever here, and today we are reviewing one of Sigma's more popular art series lenses. This is the Sigma 85mm f1.4 Art, designed for Canon and Nikon DSLR cameras. And I'm going to start right now. Now, over recent years, Sigma really have changed the game when it comes to third-party lenses. Traditionally, they would always be worse than their native lens counterpart, but Sigma, with their art series, really have changed the old ecosystem of third-party. So how well does this lens fare up versus the Zeiss, Canon, and other lenses on the market? Let's find out in this lens review. So let's kick this lens review off with build quality, something that Sigma always do really well, especially their art series lenses. They're usually made out of full metal and magnesium construction, and this lens is no different. This lens has also got one of the largest filter threads I have ever seen, with an 86mm filter thread. Pretty much everything about this lens is incredibly large. Have a look at that focus ring there. It is genuinely gigantic and monsters over anything else with this lens. You've also got a really small focus window, and you've got an autofocus to manual focus switch. Now, you don't have an image stabilization switch because this lens here does not come with image stabilization. This lens is also one of a kind really in their art series lineup. This lens comes with weather sealing, and you have a look at other art series like for instance the 35 or 50, they don't come with weather sealing, and I've always found it's a little bit lacking, but this lens here has the full weather sealing enabled. So overall, I've got to admit the actual build quality and the overall design of this lens is absolutely exquisite and definitely on par with the Canon 85mm f1.4. So because of that, I'm going to be giving it a 10 out of 10. Now, something that I've so far liked from the Sigma art series lineup is the image quality. I've really liked the sharpness, the contrast, the colors, and pretty much everything when it comes to the art series lineup. So how well does this lens line up when it comes to the other lenses on the market, specifically the Canon 85mm f1.4, which I've only recently tested? Well, let's go and have a look at a few sample images. Now, I used this lens at a wedding, and to be honest, an 85mm prime lens is absolutely excellent in a wedding environment. You've got a great amount of focal length to get nice and close, but you're not too tight, like for instance 135mm, where you're blocking out a lot of the environment. Now, couple that with the 1.4 aperture, you can really have some nice separation of the foreground and background, which makes this lens excellent for portraits, which is why it fits really well when it comes to the overall wedding environment. So I must say I was impressed by the actual image quality of this lens, especially the center sharpness, but also the foreground and background separation with the really handy aperture of f1.4. So overall, I really think this lens is absolutely excellent in a wedding and an overall events environment, but it's also great for other types of photography. So let's go and have a look a bit more in detail at the sharpness by looking at a graph. So starting out at f1.4, you can see there is really good sharpness in the center. Now, if we go over to the corners, they are noticeably darker and a little bit softer, but I must say it's not too much of a difference. The overall contrast and colors also look really good as well. Now, to get the best out of this lens, I would probably recommend stepping down a couple of stops. So if you go ahead and step to f2, you'll notice that the overall consistency of the colors and the brightness, the luminance, is a lot more consistent. And you'll also see the actual sharpness is being increased slightly, but it must say even at 1.4 this lens is very sharp. So if we go ahead and step down to 2.8, it's a very similar story, although I would say it has a smidge more sharpness, and that's pretty much the rest of the story continues. f4 is very similar, f5.6, and all the way to f8. Anything beyond f8, I did find that diffraction did start playing a larger role, and it started softening the corners a little bit, and that's just due to diffraction. And I would say that f11 and f16. So if you're planning on wanting to use this lens, I'd probably recommend between either f2 all the way to f8. And now let's have a quick look at distortion and vignetting. Now, as you can see, the cast of this graph here, there is pretty much no distortion to be seen. It is a very flat image, but there is a mild amount of vignetting, which to be honest, is not something that you'd notice, especially on most images. But on this graph, you can see there is a mild amount. Now, you can reduce that kind of vignetting if you go ahead and step down to f2, and you can pretty much completely remove it at f2.8. And beyond that, there is no vignetting. So let's go and quickly have a look at flaring. Now, as you can see, the flaring on this lens is actually reduced. It has a good amount of contrast even when you're pointing in direct light, and there isn't only a small amount of this yellowy greeny flaring that you can see when you move it around the image. So overall, I think the flaring of this lens is really reduced and definitely worth getting if you're planning on shooting anything towards any bright lights. So I think overall this actual lens here scored really high when it comes to image quality. I think the sharpness was really good. I think the actual flaring reduction, the actual elements in here are really good, reducing the amount of flaring. And it's something that I think outperforms the Canon lens is this Sigma lens here. Now with a minimum focus distance of just 85 centimeters, you can actually use this for macro as well. It's not, again, not technically designed for macro, but you can get away with it with this lens. So it's another thing to add to the arsenal. So overall, I think this lens scored really high. Not as good as the Canon lens. I would say the Canon lens did outperform it, but not by much, which is something to say for this Sigma lens here. So overall, I'm going to be giving it a solid 9 out of 10. So now let's move on to the elephant in the room, and that's right, we're talking about this lens here. This lens is gigantic and far bigger than any other 85mm prime lens I've tested, even the f1.2 that Canon have to offer. This lens is huge. Now, if we go ahead and remove the quite large lens hood, it is still very big and far bigger than the Canon 85mm f1.4. And to think that lens comes with image stabilization. So this lens here, if we go ahead and put it in a chart situation here, you can see how much larger this lens is. In fact, the actual filter thread of this lens is gigantic with a solid 86mm compared to just 77 of the Canon lens. Now, if we go and have a look at weight, again, very similar story. This lens here comes in a whopping 1,210 grams, where if we go and have a look at the Canon 85mm f1.4, that gets reduced down to 950 grams. Then, if we go and have a look at the Canon 85mm f1.8, that comes in at 425 grams. And then lastly, the lightest is the Samyang 85mm f1.4. That comes in at 485 grams. So overall, this lens is genuinely massive, and it's definitely something to consider if you're thinking of maybe going hiking with a lens. I would highly recommend the Canon 85mm 1.8 because it is a lot smaller and a lot lighter while offering a similar aperture of just f1.8. So because of that, I'm only going to be giving this lens a 4 out of 10. Now, another thing to consider about this lens is its focusing, but also image stabilization. Something that I think the Canon lens has all other prime lens be is image stabilization. It is unbelievably helpful in either low light environments or if you're wanting to use this lens for video. This lens here annoyingly does not have that option. It's also got not the best autofocus. I must say it is quick, but it isn't necessarily as precise as I wanted. Out of about 100 shots, I would say between 15 to 20% are going to be either way out of focus or slightly out of focus. Now, it is performing a little bit better on mirrorless cameras, but I would say using it with traditional DSLRs, like for instance the Canon 6D Mark II, which I used this lens on, I've got to admit the overall autofocus precision wasn't as best as I was expecting. Other Art series lenses way outperform that, and the Canon lens is far superior in this particular situation. So if you're wanting to use this lens in a fast-paced environment with fast-moving objects, I must say the actual autofocus might not be as good as you expect. So because of that, I'm actually only going to be giving this lens a 5 out of 10. And last but most importantly is price. How well is this lens priced versus the competition? Well, traditionally, Art series lenses are far cheaper than the L series counterparts. In some situations, they're about half the price. So really, Art series lenses are really good value for money. So let's have a look at how well this lens is priced versus the L series lens. The Sigma 85mm f1.4 comes in at £929 versus the Canon 85mm f1.4 IS L series lens comes in at a whopping £1,489. So there's about a £500 difference between them, which in the grand scheme of things isn't necessarily a large difference when you think the actual Canon lens comes with image stabilization and a far better and superior autofocus system. Now, if we go and have a look at the Canon 85mm f1.8, its cheaper brother, that comes in at far less of £339. And the other third-party 85mm prime lens we can look at is the Samyang. The Samyang 85mm f1.4 comes in around middle at £539, although that doesn't necessarily have also the best autofocus system. So overall, I would say the best value for money is the Canon 85mm f1.8, coming in far cheaper than all other lenses on my list today, but offers a similar aperture of this lens of 1.8. And if you're after the best image quality and the overall best performing lens, I would then say it's the Canon 85mm f1.4L, because it's got a far better autofocus system, but it also has that kind of extra sparkle of having image stabilization. This lens kind of falls in the middle while offering great image quality. It just doesn't have that image stabilization, which really does make a big difference between the Canon versus this Sigma lens here. It's still great value for money and definitely worth buying, but if you're after a more of a hybrid lens, like for instance ones that offers image stabilization for video, then I'd highly recommend the Canon lens for only just a smidge bit more, just that extra £500. So overall, I'm going to be giving this lens a 7 out of 10 for price. So let's quickly move on to pros and cons to really work out, is this lens worth a spot in your camera bag? So first off, this lens comes with absolutely exquisite build quality. I love this about Art Series lenses, and this has the added bonus of weather sealing. This lens also comes with a really bright aperture of f1.4. It's not the brightest out there, but it will let a ton of light, and it's great for low light photography. This lens also has great image quality as well, with great sharpness, on par with the Canon 85mm f1.4 that's £500 more. This lens is also a lot cheaper than the Canon lens, coming in at £500 less, while still offering great image quality and build quality. So now let's quickly have a look at the cons of this lens and why you shouldn't have it in your camera bag. To kick it all off, the size and weight of this lens is gigantic, and you can get a lot lighter and smaller lenses with the same aperture if you ever have a look at the Canon or Samyang. This also got a gigantic filter thread of 86mm, which will firstly mean that your filters are going to be really expensive, but also if you're bought into the standard 82mm size, you're going to have to buy entirely new filters. It's also got quite a slow and not very precise autofocus, which can really let you down in a fast-paced environment. It's also one of the more expensive Art Series lenses out there, far more expensive than the 24, 35 and 50 Art Series, which are currently out on the market. So overall, I would say it's a mixed bag between the pros and cons. There are some great pros when it comes to image quality and build quality, but the size and weight really does let this lens down. So let's go and have a look at final results. So overall, to be honest, it's a bit of a mixed bag with this lens here. Usually Art Series lenses score incredibly high. This did in image quality and overall build quality, but it lets itself down when it comes to the actual autofocus of this lens, but the actual size and weight. This lens is gigantic, and think with a filter thread of 86mm, it isn't necessarily going to fit into everyone's camera bag. It is far larger than the Canon 85mm f1.4, even though it still offers the same aperture, and that lens comes with image stabilization. So I'm not sure how they've done it, but they've created a gigantic lens. Has great image quality, but it's not necessarily the smallest lens you're ever going to have. Now the overall score reflected that, coming in with just a 35 out of 50. Not the highest scoring lens I've ever had, but also not the lowest. Again, bit of a mixed bag on that one. So I would recommend this lens, but I would actually recommend other lenses higher than this, just because of they've got the added benefit of being smaller, being lighter, or even having image stabilization, like the Canon 85mm f1.4, which I actually recommend over this lens here. But what do you guys think? Make sure to write down in the comments below if you own this lens and love it. If you own this lens and you're not too sure and you maybe want to change over after this review, or if you're thinking about getting this lens, make sure to write it down in the comments below to help you other fellow photographers out in your buying choices.